See my first slide?
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so let's begin. 10 o'clock. Thank you all for coming. I am very happy you could all make it. It is a bit nicer to have a genuine audience instead of just presenting to my computer. So, oh, I forgot to change the date. Look at me go. I meant to do this last week and then I felt overwhelmed and I changed it to this week. So I'm Michelle Krasniqi. I'm a carried instructor at Okanagan College in Kelowna. I sometimes teach in Vernon as well, but mostly here in Kelowna. So for PIDP, this is my second elective, and I've done 3 core courses, and I'm working on the 4th right now. So I'm in 2 courses right now, and I'm looking forward to this being my final presentation in this particular elective. So working my way through and really enjoying what I'm learning. So my agenda for this morning, I have a little story to share about why I chose cognitive load theory. And then a little bit about the background of John Sweller and cognitive load theory. We're going to talk about schemas because when I was reading through, I kind of struggled with what is a schema? What does that really mean? It's kind of a new word for me. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the different types of cognitive load and then so what? How do we practically apply that in the classroom setting? So a couple of the attendees today were actually in the in-person course with Doug back in August. And in one of my presentations, I decided that it would be really helpful to split the class up evenly using some kind of creative technique. And so I started my presentation. If your name starts with the letter J, go to the left side of the classroom. If your name starts with any other letter, go to the right hand of the classroom. And then I carried on through my instructions. And I said at the end, okay, now you can go get into your groups. And I must have given too many instructions because people were like walking around in circles. They did not know what their name was. They could not remember anymore. So I kind of had a like, how was that difficult? Why did people struggle with that? And they didn't know about cognitive load theory at that point. So I talked about it with Doug. He said in my review of that presentation that he had noticed that as well and probably had something to do with cognitive load theory. So here I am in another course with Doug, and I want to explore more about cognitive load theory because I've seen it in action, and when people get overloaded, what happens? So in 1988, John Sweller described the concept of working memory and schemas, which became a foundation for cognitive load theory. So cognitive load theory basically states that we have short-term memory or working memory and long-term memory. And if our working memory gets overloaded, it doesn't function well. So working memory is agreed by most that it can handle about 3 to 6 items. Some people say 5 to 8. So it really depends who you ask. And it does depend on the person. Some people can only handle 3 kind of items at a time. So if you give 4 pieces of directions, one of those is going to get lost because they can only process 3 things at a time. So that kind of explains why you can say the same lecture to a class and some of them will totally get it. And some of them will come back to you and say, I've never heard this before. I have no idea what you're talking about. I have found that in my current class, they really struggle, a few of them, with this cognitive load. I can kind of piece out, now that I've done this research, who kind of has that lower level, maybe the 3 or the 4, and then who can handle a little bit more. When I was looking at this, I was thinking about the movie Inside Out. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it's a movie about emotions and memories. And at the end of the day, when the character goes to sleep, they talk about getting those days' memories moved to long term, which is not actually how it works. Our brains are constantly processing information throughout the day. They scan the information, decide whether it's important or not. If it's important, it will get processed through working memory. And if it's unimportant, they'll just forget it. So our long-term memories are described in Sweller's theory as something called schemas. So the brain has these kind of chunks of long-term memory that are stored in pieces in the brain. So you might have a schema about how to snowboard, and you might have a schema about how to teach, and you might have a schema about how to play soccer or how to cook, or all these things that you've learned how to do throughout your life. And if your brain is introduced to new information in your working memory, it will process that, and then it will go into a schema. So it will attach to a schema that is related to the new information. So the bigger your schemas get, the easier it is for your working memory to say, okay, you need to go there, you need to go there, you need to go there. If memories or information doesn't fit into a new or existing schema, we can make a new schema, or our brain will kind of adapt an existing schema to say, oh, well, what I thought I knew about this was not actually true. So we need to move this out and make way for this new information because this is actually correct. So I kind of think about this storage and filing and working memory to long-term memory as moving into a new house and getting a new kitchen. And you put things away where you think they're going to go, but as you're working through cooking a meal, you kind of forget where things went, and it takes you longer to process that working memory. As you become more familiar with the content of an idea or information or concept or course, you get faster at putting those things away in the right thing. You might not have to open as many cupboards. So our working memory is able to process through things that are connected to existing schemas that we're comfortable with much faster. So when I think about adapting schemas and creating new schemas, as a nurse, when I became a parent, some of the things that had to do with having a baby and healthcare for an infant, my area expertise has always been older adults, gerontology. But some of that fit in with baby care too. You know, if you've changed an adult diaper, you have changed the baby's diaper. It's nothing new. It fit into those schemas really well. But there's other things where, as I became a parent, I really had no idea, and I needed to create whole new areas of knowledge, baby-led weaning, and toilet training, and gentle parenting, and all of that stuff. So you can create new schemas throughout the lifetime. We never stop learning, and our brains can always create those new schemas. So then we get into these 3 types of cognitive load. So intrinsic cognitive load is the difficulty of the task itself. The difficulty in your brain is related to the schemas that you already have in place. So for most people who have worked around a kitchen before, learning a new cookie recipe would be quite easy compared to the intrinsic load of learning a complex algebra equation. I'm not a math person, so I don't know if that was a good analogy. I hope it was. But if you're a math professor who's never stepped foot in a kitchen, probably it would be much easier for you because of your existing schemas to process that algebra question versus find your way around a kitchen when it's something you've never done before. So the goal of teaching is to manage that intrinsic load. So pre-assessment can play a role. How much information do they have about it already? And how much more do they need? And as well, we can talk about like that chunk and chew method. So giving people small pieces of a puzzle at a time, working towards the end goal of that complex problem. Excuse me. Extraneous cognitive load are things that are not related to the task at all. So if your presentation has lots of flashing videos or animations on it that aren't related to the concept that you're teaching, that becomes extraneous cognitive load. Same with noise and distractions and cell phones, and all of those sorts of things become extraneous load. So they fill up that working memory. They'll take up 2 or 3 or 4 bits of your working memory, and then you only have room for maybe 1 or 2 or no content that you're actually trying to learn. And then germane load or generative load, as Maddie Field described it, is the work of moving memory into long-term memory. So that germane load takes effort and cognitive space, but it's actually the work of solving the problem, learning the new thing. So we want to manage intrinsic load, we want to reduce extraneous load, and we want to encourage germane load, because that is what's actually going to turn that working memory piece into a long-term stored item. So then how, as instructors or teachers, do we practically apply this information? So a big thing for me out of this research has been how to practically apply this. So we can reduce extraneous cognitive load by encouraging learners to have their cell phones put away, or to close the door so it's quiet, to discourage background chatter in the classroom, removing redundant or irrelevant elements, minimizing distractions, and just making sure that our presentations are clean and streamlined and that they are directly relevant to what we're trying to teach. So managing intrinsic cognitive load, which is related to the complexity of the material, can be really challenging in a classroom because, for example, I have 30 students, and they all have different ranges of pre-existing knowledge. They have pre-existing levels of whether they did their prior learning reading or not. So if I'm expecting my class to have come reading the chapter and half of them haven't, the intrinsic load is going to be much higher for the people that have not read the chapter previously versus the people that came prepared for class. So sequencing the information, so starting at basics and then working your way up, maybe starting with topics about your subject that learners are likely to have experienced before, and then moving into pieces that they might have less prior knowledge on. Provide really clear directions, maybe break them up. Going back to my original example of people not knowing that their name started with J. Likely, if I had said, if your name starts with J, please stand up now and go to the left side of the room, and not added more instruction to that, probably a lot of them would have been able to remember their name in that moment. But because I had kind of piled on maybe 4 or 5 directions, people who have lower cognitive load, working memory abilities in terms of number of items they can process at once would have an easier time or harder time depending where they were. So if I overload them, they're not going to remember that their name had to start with J to go to the left side of the room. Clear explanations. So really keep it simple. Avoid extra information that's not important or relevant. Sometimes as experts in our field, we like to make sure that we tell as many stories as possible. But for a beginning learner, if that's not directly relevant, it can just be confusing. So we have to make sure that our anecdotes and our stories are really directly linked to the concept that we're teaching in order to make sure it does not overload them and that it helps apply some of those memories to working memory and then long-term memory. We want to enhance germane cognitive load, which is the cognitive load associated with processing and integration of information. So by activating prior knowledge and providing feedback and guidance, we can increase that germane load. We want to encourage active learning and reflection. So interestingly, Doug showed, I think at the beginning of this course too, that graph of when you're in class or in a lecture, your brain activity is actually turned off. So your working memory is not really processing anything if you're checked out of the lecture. So we want to have some brain activity, definitely, and we want to have actively involved learners. The Medical College of Wisconsin article I found and included in my resources described a really practical application of cognitive load theory. They did it really well. So it describes the gap between what we know and what we need to know as a problem space. So we can have a really broad problem space, and it makes really hard to make connections across that wide gap. But if we have a smaller problem space, we make that gap smaller, and it's easier to successfully learn those small gaps in learning. When I think about nursing school and what I learned in nursing school about palliative or end-of-life care, I feel like I learned almost nothing. And I came into practice so underprepared. But as I experienced more palliative care and I got more comfortable with it, and I did some more self-study to experiences that I was going through in the moment, I was really able to find passion and expertise in palliative and end-of-life care. So I took more courses, but if I had taken those courses in nursing school, that gap would have been way too big. I needed those smaller pieces of information and experience and create those schemas about palliative care in my mind before I was ready for an in-depth like masterclass on palliative care. Probably also would have overwhelmed and terrified me, and I might not have continued nursing school. So I'm hoping that this display worked and you've been able to see all my slides. But you'll notice that I kept each slide really simple. They're not huge walls of text. Too many photos, too much text, animations, all those sorts of things can add to extraneous load and actually impair what you learn about the content. So now I'm ready to open it up to questions from you. Yes, Laura.
I have a question. Actually, it's funny what you said at the end. I noticed that about your slides, that they were very simple, but I didn't clue in until you said why you did it. That was very well done.
Thank
But I'm
you.
really curious about this idea of schemas. So if it's easier to get things into long-term memory, if you have an established schema for something, do you have any tips or ideas about how, is there a way to tap into your students' existing schemas when you're doing instruction on something?
Yes, that's really what our pre-assessment comes down to. So coming up with those like really thoughtful pre-assessment questions is really going to help tap into what they know and what they don't know and where you need to bridge those gaps.
That makes sense.
But pre-assessment is not easy.
Yeah, especially if you have a group of varied learners with different abilities and different experiences, it can be tough.
Totally. It's a very challenging piece. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in it myself either. Darrell, did I say your name right? I hope so.
Yeah, it's Daryl. Thanks for the presentation, Michelle. I'm doing one later today on neuroplasticity, and a lot of your pieces, especially on the extraneous, if I said that right, like reducing noise and reducing, like not over prompting, like align with neuroplasticity as well. So that was really fun to see. My question is, does someone's ability to have like a large or small cognitive load change with age?
I didn't see anything that related it specifically to age. I never found a ton of information on exactly why people have varying loads or capabilities. It just kind of is an intrinsic factor, something you either have or you don't. But yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to know if there's a way to improve that cognitive load piece and the working memory function for people.
Great, thanks.
Joe?
Yeah, as you were going through, made me think of a recent experience I had. I have way too many courses right now. I'm doing 4. And yeah, well,
Cognitive overload, hey, Joe?
Yeah, exactly. And so what happened was, oh God, I can't remember. A couple weeks ago, I was sitting here trying to work and I just couldn't do anything. And I said, okay, start with the simple stuff. So I did a reflective writing that I had to do. And I noticed in the process of doing that, everything seemed to, fall into place. And what I've started doing since then is whenever I start to feel a little overloaded, because I'm working 6 to 8 hours a day on school, is I just do a reflective writing, whether it's assigned or not. So, and I'm listening to what you said. Now, is the reflection, what would that be the process of? Is that moving it from, the building the germane part, in, I don't know how to really phrase it, but it really caught my attention because this is just
so
something I
think
discovered.
part of that is that you're putting paper, like pen to paper, and letting your thoughts go onto the paper. And as you kind of let go of those pieces, it helps you process them, but it will also kind of help reduce that cognitive load because your brain says, okay, now it's down. I can let that go for a minute and I can come back to it. It takes some of that pressure off. So it lets you kind of process a piece at a time. And then, you're not going to forget it. So your brain's not like swirling, trying to make sure it stays in that working memory. It's like actually doing the processing work, maybe moving it to long-term, maybe just letting it go on the paper and knowing you feel comfortable that you can come back to it.
Yeah, because it was so disorganized. Like I was confusing courses. I was writing and I'd start writing about the wrong course.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
You were one of the people who forgot your name started with a J, weren't you?
Joe was, yes.
Yeah, you were.
Jamie?
Perfect. Thanks. That was a great presentation. Something that stood out to me was I'm a culinary instructor, so when you talked about keeping your stories directly linked to kind of what you're talking about, I'll find myself a lot of times, a student will ask about something and I'll relate it to, one of my old jobs, and I'll start talking about it, and then I'll, it'll be 10 minutes later and I'll be like, what was the question even about? So, I really it really made me think a little bit more about, sticking to the facts and, trying to stay with the topic and not, get pushed aside. So it made me think more about it. So thanks.
Yeah, it's really easy to get kind of down those rabbit holes, and I find myself doing it too, but this research really did help me kind of try and streamline that and be a little bit more intentional. So
definitely. Thank you.
Thanks. Sarah?
Yeah, no, it was a really great presentation. I actually really appreciated how like clean and like simple the slides were, 'cause it was very easy to kind of focus on what you were saying about cognitive load theory, and to really just like in our heads even picture like the intrinsic, extrinsic, and germane, how that all kind of ties together. So that was actually very, very helpful. And it's very informative in what works well in presentations, I think. The other thing that really stood out to me, and it's actually because I'm also a nurse. So when I think about nursing instruction, when we were in school, it's just information overload, and nothing ever really stays. I'm wondering, in your experience, since you teach in a Carrie's school, what is it like if wait, sorry, do you teach in like hospital settings or specifically like the academic coursework?
I do theory, lab, and practicum. So I go all across all three settings.
Oh, okay. In your practicum setting, when you don't really have as much control on, say, like the extraneous factors in the environment, whether that's noise, call bells, whatever it is, what are some strategies to get someone to kind of focus a bit more and ignore those extraneous factors, and I guess like increase your ability to focus on specific things?
So I think finding like a quiet meeting space, I know that can be challenging, but finding those quiet spaces away from the call bells really does help, because I find even giving feedback in a clinical setting, if there's like call bells and patients yelling and all of that other stuff going on, it's hard for me to even focus on giving it. So I've even resorted to using like stairwells, just anywhere people aren't actively doing stuff and making noises and passing by. Like even sometimes those like back hallways and back stairwells have been really helpful just for kind of reducing the cognitive distractions.
Okay, so really actually just physically moving yourself from that distracting environment.
Yeah, as much as possible. That's going to be a huge piece of it.
Okay.
Daryl, did you have another question, or did you just have your hand up from before?
I just had my hand up from before.
Okay.
Sorry.
I just wanted to make sure you didn't have something else. And then Milagros, I'm sorry if I didn't get that right.
Yes. My name is Milagros. Michelle, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting topic. I am interested in this topic because, well, I am the department head in one of the programs at VCC. And it's very interesting because it's a full-time program and we have several courses, like the students have to go through, like 5-6 courses workload. And sometimes it's a lot. It's a lot of information, and how we need to make sure that there's connections between those courses so they are not, the student is not overload of information and forgetting. So they can thread between the courses, and say, hey, like in this course, we talk about this. This is how I applied in this course. So I think it's very interesting because it's good for, like somebody who would like to create a new program or a new program, or under a review of a program, okay, what it's important to do. So thank you for all the information that you provided.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think a really interesting piece of cognitive load theory that would apply to you there is knowing that people forget pieces, right? So if you interweave kind of a lot of the content through multiple courses and kind of revisit it, it's either good review and people can like learn to get that out of their long-term memory, like visit those schemas and retrieve that information, or it gives your students who maybe didn't process it into a schema the first time you talked about it, if you revisit it, it gets it into their working memory again. And then maybe your working memory says, I think maybe I've heard this before. It sounds important. It gives them like another try to get it moved over into a like long-term schema. Joe?
Yeah, I was wondering if you ran into anything in your research that showed if any classroom assessment techniques performed, regularly help deal with the cognitive load, if somebody had done any documentation of that.
So interestingly, one of the things that came up about cognitive load and kind of classroom techniques wasn't so much about the assessment, but even about keeping a regular routine. So even just saying every day we're going to go for our first coffee break from 9 to 9:30, and every day our lunch is going to be from 12 to 1. If they're not sitting in their desk with kind of a rumbly tummy, wondering when you're going to let them out, even something that simple will help them say, that thought will come into their mind. They'll say, oh, no, I know that lunch is in half an hour, and they can let that go. And then they can come back to like the actual important cognitive load processing. So
interesting. So it's like you build your own schema for your class. The
totally,
students,
yeah.
You help them concern. Wow, that's neat.
So I was really surprised to learn that even something as simple as just like a consistent schedule and like those classroom routines can really help. So even if they know every morning they're going to get like a pre-assessment quiz or a review quiz or something like that, like if you start those classes the same way every day, it can help them just like come ready to learn and be ready and then know what's coming and not have to worry about. And it turns that worry off and lets the rest of the cognitive processing take over.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that it for questions? Doug is going to be so proud because it's 10:33 and I have 30 to 40 minutes.
Great.
Time management. That was one thing I really struggled with this summer in that in-person course. So
you're much more polished.
Thank you.
No, really. And if any of you haven't taken 3230 yet, what you presented today is so appropriate for that assessment course. I wish
I'm
this
taking that right
presentation
now,
had
yeah.
been 3 days ago.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out today, everybody.
Great presentation. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle. Good to see you guys again.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
to see
so
you
much.
both.
Yeah. Take care.
Great
everybody.
job, Michelle.
Bye.
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 Thank you,
Bye.
Michelle. Bye.